Welcome to Modern Latin America in 15 minutes. My name is Dr. Kim Richardson, and today I would like to discuss very broadly land and cities. Now, by reading any textbook, you can kind of tease out some of this information, but now I'm going to paint the broad picture with huge, broad strokes. Let me explain. In the 20th century, from the early 20th century even into the 21st century, the elites and the middle classes of Latin America, they enjoyed and continue to enjoy many of the benefits of modern societies. They have color TVs, they have smartphones, they have computers, they have internet, they have all these really modern things. But the situation for the masses is not improving. It's getting worse. They're barely surviving. In fact, some historians argue they exist rather than live. Why is this? Well, as this 1962 cartoon demonstrates, his father lives up here. This is extreme wealth. Extreme wealth tends to breed extreme poverty. And as we're going to see here, that is because of land maldistribution. Extreme wealth breeds extreme poverty, and extreme poverty tends to breed revolution. Revolution, of course, is trying to switch this system around, change things, overturn the apple cart, so to speak. So the major problem still plaguing Latin America throughout the 20th century was and is land maldistribution. It's divided into latifundia and minifundia. So let's say it's like this. If you get a big piece of land, you purchase it somehow, or it's deeded over to you. That is called latifundia. You can use it any way you want to. It's yours. Sometimes people live on it, where you have them work for you and you give them maybe coupons or money to be used at the company's store. Maybe your land is, when you die, you divide it amongst your heirs, and then they divide it amongst their heirs. And over generations, that little piece, that huge piece of land gets smaller and smaller. This is going to be called minifundia. It's too small to be effectively used. Well, the reality is that both of these are not being effectively used. Latifundia is too big to be effectively used. Minifundia is too small to be effectively used. So by the middle of the 20th century, something like 17% of the landowners ended up controlling 90% of the land. So most of the land are in the hands of just a few people. And you say, well, so what's wrong with that? If you take out that and you just have the latifundia, the first issue is it's not being cultivated properly. Some people argue that a mere 10% of the land holdings is being properly cultivated, right? That means 90% are not being used correctly. Now, that's not such a bad thing unless we have such a huge global population that it needs to be used. Those that do own the land, they want to grow something, raise something, and focus on export. They sell goods on the open market and, in turn for that, import food. So the rich landowner gets richer and he imports food, and the food is way overpriced, but that's okay, because since the landowner is making a fortune, the higher cost of food imported is acceptable. That's okay. Governments like this. They like this because they can tax the exports and the imports. It's very easy to tax exports. You just make sure that whenever something's leaving the ports, you pay your taxes. Or coming in, pay your taxes. Well, the masses, they do not like this because the cost of food will go up. But do their wages go up? No. Generally, their wages do not go up, but the cost of food goes up, so that as the century progresses, they find themselves getting into worse and worse economic situations. Now, the government, they kind of like the exports because it is, again, easier to tax. It's very difficult to go to somebody's subsistence agricultural plot of land and tax the food that they have. So in other words, Latin America comprises, 16% of the world's cultivatable land. Land that can be raised crops on. But it only has 6% of the world's population, something like that. But at the same time, it has the hungriest people. Well, among the hungriest. So they have more land per capita than any other place, yet they are not able to feed themselves. So here's a great image. What's the matter with not just Mexico? Remember this? This was from the revolution, but Latin America. Land maldistribution. Land barons are controlling the workers who are having to work the land. So let us suppose that this is your situation living in Latin America all throughout the 20th century. What are you going to do? One thing you can do is move to the city. Moving to the city because it has promise of opportunities. Maybe you have a cousin or an uncle or somebody that's moved to the city and he writes you and says, look, I got a job and I'm doing fine, I'm doing great. And you say, wow, I want to move to the city. So you move to the city and you live with him, but you can't get a job. He was lucky and you're unemployed. And then everybody else moves in and then the situation does not get better. But let us suppose, though, that you do get a job. Moving to the city or the cities do not solve the problems if the landowners continue to focus on exports. Why? Because if the landowners are exporting things on the global market, but they're not growing food for you to ship to the cities, then the cities have to buy the food from abroad, which is going to raise the cost of the food. Imports, then, will become more and more expensive. The foodstuffs does not go down just because you move to the city. In fact, the cost of food keeps going up because you're importing it, and your salaries do not necessarily equate to that. That's the cost of living. Even where land redistribution does occur, like Mexico throughout the 20th century had a system of land redistribution, not as much as they promised with the Mexican Revolution, but they do have a land redistribution. More than this is needed. I mean, yeah, they got land redistribution, but you got to distribute seeds and education. And when the government can, it will. But the government cannot always do this. Its money sometimes is earmarked for other needs. And so that even when you redistribute land, it doesn't solve the problem. So why doesn't then land reform work? That's a great problem. Number one, landowners, will not consider any plan that threatens their livelihood. They say, whoa, hold on a second. You want to redistribute the land that belongs to me? That's not going to happen. And they're going to do everything within their power to make sure it does not happen. The middle class as well. They oftentimes are from the masses, from the rural population or whatever, and they work all their lives, and they go to school, they take night school, and they finally have made it. They're going to abandon any attempts at reform. They say, I worked all my life for what I have, and you want me just to give it to you for free? That's not going to happen, right? So they say they will, but once they've made it, they abandon many attempts at reforms. Not always. This is a generalities here. And number three, masses. They're unorganized. The masses, of course, are much more populous than everybody else, but until they're organized, not a whole lot can be done. They've got to get organized. In some places, say Mexico, frequently, they're going to get masses. And the urban masses that we're going to see are going to vote as well. And that's going to be productive. So then what is the choices? As you can see by this particular cartoon, revolution is going downhill, reform is going uphill. You got two paths that you can follow then. If you have the problem of land maldistribution, you can choose revolution, but it's kind of like if you have a 2-year-old that's running downhill really fast, you know they're going to trip and fall down and bloody their nose. They can get back up again and keep going if they so choose, but not always will they choose to do so. The other option is reform. Reform, you're less likely to fall and bloody your nose, but it's much more difficult. It's a path strewn with rocks. Which path can you follow if you see that the problems are land maldistribution? And that is a big situation. Perhaps the answer then, argue the politicians through the 20th century, is to provide jobs to the workers in the cities. Once all those workers move to the cities, many people say, as you can see by the images on the bottom, industry is the key to modernization. We must have industry. We got to do it. Well, how do you really get industries? You could have subsidies or multiple exchange rates, import controls, tax privileges, or one of those things. So oftentimes the government will take the initiative to try to form industries in the cities. So even where you don't have land redistribution in the countryside, you could probably get it so that in the cities people can survive and make decent amounts of money. And even though the cost of food, because it's imported, will be high, your wages might be high, so that's okay. Well, some of the characteristics of industrialization, however, ended up being focused on few urban centers, right? You could say Latin America, the major cities, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, for Brazil, Mexico City, and a couple cities up north for Mexico, Guatemala City for Guatemala, Lima for Peru. You got a few urban centers that gets huge, and the rest of the area tends to remain fairly rural. And they focus on small factories and plants, right? It's very difficult to have a factory that employs 50,000 workers. But if you did have a big factory, then you could offer better incentives to your workers, like health care benefits and old age pensions. Whereas small factories, you can't do that, right? So where they do have industrialization, it's not going to provide as much to the masses, to the working class, as what will be provided in the big factories, say Detroit, Michigan. And a lot of the stuff that they consume is they make are consumer items, right? It used to be, it's not the case recently, but it used to be that all the leather shoes, right, what came out of Brazil, that was small consumer items for the people, not the big, heavy, mass-produced things, you know. They might manufacture cars, but for the most part, they don't have those major industry items. What they do have is a lot of people live in the cities. So Latin America ends up becoming a place where you have lots of people, and they will take whatever work they can get. So you form assembly plants, especially in, say, the Caribbean or Central America in the 1980s. People that move to the cities, they're willing to work for whatever. So a lot of people will send the companies down south of the border, and people will work for a minimum wage. They're called Maquiladoras with regards to Mexico. So south of the Rio Grande, there's a whole bunch of the Maquiladora factories. And in these Maquiladoras, as you can imagine, the goods are shipped south of the border to take advantage of the labor in Mexico. And the Mexican laborers are being paid much less than the laborers in the United States. The thing is manufactured, whether it be notebooks or whatever, and then it's shipped back over the border and sold in the United States. So, for example, Levi jeans are put together in Mexico in these assembly plants, and then shipped back over to the United States, and then you can buy them at Walmart or whatever. But generally, they're not as cheap as you would imagine. They are cheap, but they're cheaper than they would be had they been made here in the United States. A better example is here where I live, which is Lancaster, South Carolina. Here in Lancaster, South Carolina, a decade ago, everybody worked at a company called Springs. It was a textile plant. Well, they decided that what they're going to do, because minimum wage today, and I don't know what it was 10 years ago, but today, the minimum wage to employ somebody there would be $15,080. And then I did that by trying $7.25 an hour, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. Okay, plus you got all these benefits. You got to pay the employees a great deal of money. But then if you ship it down to Brazil, which is what they did 6-7 years ago, they shipped it down there, and there in Brazil, they only have to pay the equivalent of $310, $320 a month minimum wage, and you times that by 12, that's about $3,720. So you could take advantage of cheap labor by shipping the goods, the assembly plant things, down across the border into Latin America. Okay, so what we're trying to say is that Latin America had a land maldistribution problem, and still does. So people move to the cities, and the cities get bigger. As people move to the cities, there is a lack of infrastructure. And all throughout every single major city in Latin America, there are these shanty towns that are springing up. This is one in Brazil. It's called a favela. And all over every single major city is going to have a favela because there's not the infrastructure as people move to the cities. Okay, so the whole point here is really to point out that, and this lecture is called Land and Cities, that the problem with Latin America throughout the 20th century has been land maldistribution, either latifundia or minifundia. So many people move to the cities, but the cities lack infrastructure, and the cost of food is super high because of imports. However, because there's so many people, then it's ripe for the sweatshops. They're not called sweatshops, they're called assembly plants or maquiladoras. That is Modern Latin America in 15 minutes.